Christopher Columbus, The Voyage That Connected Two Worlds. Columbus and the Transformation of History Part 1. Europe before Columbus. In the middle decades of the 15th century, Europe stood on the periphery of the known world. The great centers of wealth, learning, and power lay far to the east, in Constantinople, in Cairo, in the cities of India, and beyond them in distant Cathay. The European economy depended fundamentally upon trade with these distant regions, particularly the commerce in spices, silks, and other luxury goods that flowed westward along routes controlled by merchants and powers far beyond European influence. The spice trade alone justified extraordinary effort and expense. Black pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and ginger served not merely as flavoring, but as essential preservatives in an age without refrigeration. A successful cargo of pepper could return profits of several 100%. Yet these precious commodities traveled through a complex network of middlemen, from the Spice Islands through Indian Ocean ports, across the Arabian Peninsula or through Persia, into the Eastern Mediterranean, and finally into European markets. Each intermediary added costs, and Christian Europeans increasingly found themselves at a disadvantage in this commerce. The situation grew more precarious in 1453 when Ottoman Turkish forces captured Constantinople, completing the conquest of the Byzantine Empire. Though the Ottomans did not close eastern trade routes entirely, their control introduced additional complications and expenses. The fall of Constantinople sent reverberations throughout Christian Europe, symbolizing both military vulnerability and economic constraint. Portugal had already begun seeking alternatives. Under Prince Henry the Navigator, who died in 1460, Portuguese mariners had pushed steadily down the African coast. They established trading posts, sought gold, and searched for a sea route around Africa that might provide direct access to the wealth of the Indies. By the 1480s, Portuguese expeditions under captains like Diogo Cao and Bartolomé Dias had reached progressively farther south. Dias would round the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, proving that an eastern sea route to Asia was indeed possible. These voyages depended upon significant advances in maritime technology and knowledge. European shipwrights had developed the caravel, a vessel combining the square rigging of northern Europe with the lateen sails of the Mediterranean, creating a ship capable of sailing closer to the wind while maintaining adequate cargo capacity. Navigation instruments improved as well. The magnetic compass, originally a Chinese invention, had become standard equipment. Astrolabes and quadrants allowed mariners to determine latitude by measuring the height of celestial bodies above the horizon. Portolan charts provided increasingly accurate representations of coastlines, though they could not yet adequately represent longitude. European geographical knowledge in this period combined genuine learning with profound misconceptions. Educated Europeans accepted that the Earth was spherical. This was not in question among the learned. Ancient authorities like Ptolemy had calculated the Earth's circumference, and medieval scholars had preserved and debated this knowledge. Marco Polo's account of his travels to China, written 2 centuries earlier, had spread knowledge of Asian geography, though his descriptions seemed almost fantastical to Western readers. Pierre Daly's Imago Mundi, completed in 1410, synthesized geographical knowledge and would become a text studied carefully by at least one ambitious mariner. The question that occupied theoretical discussions was not whether one could sail west to reach the east. The spherical Earth made this geometrically certain, but rather how far such a voyage would extend and whether any ship could carry sufficient provisions to survive the journey. Most informed estimates suggested the westward distance was prohibitively vast. A few scholars and mariners, however, believed the distance might be manageable, particularly if one accepted smaller estimates of the Earth's circumference and larger estimates of Asia's eastward extension. Sources used. Admiral of the Ocean Sea. A Life of Christopher Columbus, Samuel Eliot Morison, pp. 1946, 63-89 *Columbus, Felipe Fernández-Armesto, pp. 23-37, asterisk the discovery of the sea J. H. Parry pp. 3-61, Pathfinders Felipe Fernández-Armesto pp. 116-148, asterisk the Mapmakers John Noble Wilford pp. 3971, Part 2, Columbus's early life. Christopher Columbus was born in Genoa in 1451, the son of Domenico Colombo, a wool weaver of modest means, and Susanna Fontanarossa. His birth into the artisan class of a major Italian maritime republic would shape his ambitions and his persistent sense that he deserved greater recognition than his origins permitted. The Republic of Genoa maintained extensive Mediterranean trade networks, and the young Columbus would have grown up surrounded by maritime commerce, sailors' tailies, and the business of seafaring. The documentary record of Columbus's early years remains fragmentary. He received some education, learning to read and write, though the extent of his formal schooling is uncertain. His later writings demonstrate familiarity with works of geography, classical authorities, and religious texts, but historians debate whether this learning came from youthful education or from intensive self-study in adulthood. Columbus himself later claimed to have gone to sea at age 14, though the precise nature of his early voyages remains unclear. By his mid-20s, Columbus had certainly become an experienced sailor. He participated in trading voyages in the Mediterranean and possibly ventured into the Atlantic as part of Genoese commercial expeditions. In 1476, he sailed with a convoy bound for northern Europe. Off the Portuguese coast, the fleet engaged in battle with a Franco-Portuguese force. Columbus's ship was destroyed, but he survived by clinging to wreckage and swimming to shore. This disaster proved fortunate, for it brought him to Portugal, then the center of maritime exploration and innovation. In Lisbon, Columbus joined his younger brother Bartholomew, who worked as a chartmaker. This trade placed both brothers in contact with mariners, navigators, and those engaged in Portugal's systematic exploration of the African coast. Columbus sailed on Portuguese vessels, participating in voyages to the Portuguese possessions on the African coast and possibly venturing as far as the Gold Coast. He sailed northward as well, reaching England and possibly Iceland, where he would have heard stories of lands, perhaps Greenland or reports of Vinland, lying far to the west across the northern Atlantic. Around 1479, Columbus married Philippa Manes Perestrello, whose deceased father had been a Portuguese navigator and colonial governor. This marriage elevated Columbus socially and connected him to Portugal's seafaring aristocracy. The couple moved to Porto Santo in the Madeira Islands, where Philippa's family held properties. Their son Diego was born around 1480. During these years, Columbus studied geography intensively. He annotated his copy of Pier Daly's Imago Mundi with hundreds of marginal notes, revealing his consuming interest in the size of the Earth and the distance to Asia. From these studies and his maritime experience, Columbus developed his central conviction that the westward distance from Europe to Asia was significantly shorter than most authorities believed. He combined Ptolemy's underestimate of the Earth's circumference with Marco Polo's overestimate of Asia's eastward extension. These calculations were fundamentally flawed, but they convinced Columbus that a voyage of perhaps 2,400 nautical miles would carry a ship from the Canary Islands to Japan. The actual distance is approximately 10,600 nautical miles, but Columbus did not know that the Americas lay between Europe and Asia. By the early 1480s, Columbus had become entirely focused on organizing an expedition to test his theory. His plan required royal sponsorship. The costs and risks far exceeded what any private merchant could undertake. He would spend the next decade seeking the support that would make his vision possible. Sources used. Admiral of the Ocean Sea. A Life of Christopher Columbus, Samuel Eliot Morison, pp. 318, 47-62 Columbus, Felipe Fernández-Armesto, pp. 122, 38-51 * Columbus. The Four Voyages Laurence Bergreen pp. 3-34 * Columbus and the Quest for Jerusalem Carol Delaney pp. 2749 Part 3 Winning royal support. Columbus first approached King John II of Portugal around 1484, presenting his plan for a westward voyage to Asia. Portugal possessed the most advanced maritime capabilities in Europe, but the king's advisors rejected the proposal. Their reasoning appears to have been sound. Columbus's estimate of the distance to Asia was far too optimistic, and Portugal's eastward route around Africa showed greater promise. Disappointed and possibly concerned about debts, Columbus left Portugal for Spain, taking his young son Diego with him. His wife Felipe had died, leaving him a widower facing an uncertain future. In Spain, Columbus entered a kingdom recently unified through the marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. The Spanish monarchs were engaged in the final campaign of the Reconquista, the centuries-long effort to reclaim Iberian territory from Muslim rule. The war against the Emirate of Granada consumed enormous resources and attention, but it also cultivated an atmosphere of religious mission and territorial expansion that would eventually work in Columbus's favor. Columbus secured an introduction to the Spanish court and presented his proposal in 1486. Ferdinand and Isabella referred the matter to a commission of scholars and advisors. This commission, headed by Hernando de Talavera, the Queen's confessor, spent years examining Columbus's geographical claims. Their conclusion was essentially negative. They correctly recognized that Columbus had drastically underestimated the distance to Asia. No ship of that era could carry sufficient provisions for the actual distance involved, yet Columbus persisted. He cultivated supporters at court, including Laurence de Santanjal, a royal official who would prove crucial. He established a relationship with Butras Unruquas de Arana, who bore him a second son, Ferdinand, in 1488, though Columbus never married her. He continued his studies, accumulating books on geography and navigation, filling their margins with calculations and notes. He maintained correspondence with scholars and mapmakers. He even sent his brother Bartolomé to seek support in England and France, though these missions produced no results. The years of waiting tested Columbus severely. He lived on the margins of the court, dependent on occasional small grants and the hospitality of friars and minor nobles. He witnessed the fall of Granada in January 1492, completing the Reconquista. This victory freed the monarch's attention and resources. Yet when Columbus made another formal proposal, he was again rejected. His demands were considered excessive. He wanted noble titles, governing authority over any lands discovered, and a percentage of all revenues generated by his discoveries. Columbus began traveling toward France, apparently abandoning hope of Spanish support. At this critical moment, Laurence de Santanjal and other supporters made a final appeal to Queen Isabella. They argued that the potential rewards justified the relatively modest investment required, even if Columbus's geographical theories were uncertain. If he succeeded in reaching Asia by a western route, Spain would gain an enormous advantage. If he failed, the loss would be limited. Isabella reconsidered and sent a messenger to recall Columbus. The negotiations proceeded rapidly. In April 1492, the Spanish monarchs and Columbus signed the Capitulations of Santa Fe, the formal agreement authorizing the expedition. The document granted Columbus extraordinary privileges. He would be named Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy and Governor of any lands discovered, and would receive 1/10 of all precious metals and trade goods obtained. These titles would be hereditary, passing to his descendants. The agreement reflected both Columbus's persistent demands and the monarch's willingness to promise generously regarding territories that might never materialize. The financing came from multiple sources. The Crown provided some funds, though less than sometimes assumed. Santanjal arranged loans from Genoese bankers in Seville. The city of Palos de la Frontera was required to provide 2 ships as payment of a debt to the Crown. Columbus himself contributed a portion, probably borrowed. The total cost was approximately 2 million maravedis, a significant sum but far less than a single month's expenses for the Granada wa, Casas Yazud, Admiral of the Ocean Sea, a life of Christopher Columbus Samuel Eliot Morison Papa. 63-100 Fa Columbus Felipe Fernández-Armesto, Papa. 50-73 Columbus, The Four Voyages Laurence Bergreen, Papa. 35-65 Columbus and the Quest for Jerusalem, Carol Delaney, Papa. 5078 Hesh Part 4, The First Voyage 1493 ships gathered at Pallas in the summer of 1492. The largest, the Santa Maria, served as Columbus's flagship. She was not a caravel but a larger and heavier merchant vessel of perhaps 100 tons, with square-rigged sails on her main and foremasts and a lateen sail on her mizzen. The Nunya and the Pinta were both caravels, smaller and more maneuverable, designed for exploration rather than cargo. The Nunya displaced perhaps 60 tons, the Pinta slightly more. These were not large ships. The Santa Maria measured perhaps 60 feet in length, but they represented proven technology, capable of ocean sailing. Recruiting crews proved challenging. The expedition involved sailing into unknown waters for an indefinite period, chasing what many considered a dubious theory. Columbus required royal orders compelling the Punzun family prominent mariners from Pallas to participate. Mutun Alonso Punzun commanded the Pinta, his brother Vasant Yunyas Punzun commanded the Nunya, and their involvement brought credibility that helped attract sailors. The total complement across all three ships numbered approximately 90 men, including officers, sailors, a translator, a secretary, and representatives of the crown. The expedition departed Pallas on August 3, 1492. They sailed first to the Canary Islands, where the Pinta required repairs to her rudder, and the Nunya was re-rigged, replacing her lateen sails with square rigging for better performance in the expected easterly winds. These delays consumed 3 weeks, but they positioned the ships at the optimal departure point for a westward crossing. Columbus understood the Atlantic wind patterns better than his detractors have sometimes acknowledged. Sailing from the Canaries placed him in the latitude of the trade winds, which blow steadily westward across the Atlantic. The fleet departed the Canaries on September 6, 1492, and entered the open Atlantic. Columbus maintained detailed daily records in his journal, though the original has been lost. Bartolomé de las Casas, the Dominican friar and historian, made an extensive abstract that survives, providing our primary source for the voyage's details. Columbus recorded winds, distances sailed, the appearance of seaweed, bird suttungs, and the crew's growing anxiety as they sailed week after week westward with no sight of land. The crew's concern was not irrational. They had sailed farther into the Atlantic than any previous Spanish expedition. The winds that carried them west so efficiently would make the return voyage difficult or impossible if they proved contrary. Columbus reportedly kept 2 sets of distance calculations, showing the crew shorter distances than he privately believed they had traveled, though historians debate whether this account reflects actual practice or later embellishment. By early October, tensions had mounted significantly. The ships had been at sea for a month since leaving the Canaries, far longer than the journey Columbus had promised. Signs of land proved false. Crews discussed turning back. Columbus later claimed he faced near mutiny, though contemporary records suggest more of a contentious discussion than an outright rebellion. Mutun Alonso Punzun supported continuing westward, which may have been decisive. Land birds appeared on October 11, suggesting proximity to shore. That evening, Columbus thought he saw a light in the distance, though others could not confirm it. The fleet reduced sail and proceeded cautiously through the darkness. At approximately 2 hours after midnight on October 12, Rodrigo de Trajana, the lookout on the Pinta, spotted unmistakable land ahead and cried out. They waited for dawn to approach the shore. At daybreak they found themselves near a small island, well forested and inhabited. Columbus went ashore in the ship's boat, accompanied by the Punzun brothers and other officers, carrying the royal banner. He formally took possession of the island for the Spanish crown, naming it San Salvador. Indigenous people watched from the shore, then approached cautiously. Columbus called them Indians, believing he had reached islands off the coast of Asia. The precise identity of this first landfall has generated substantial scholarly debate. Columbus's descriptions have been matched against various candidates in the Bahamas. Watlung Island, renamed San Salvador in 1926, has traditionally been favored, but Samana Key, Plana Keys, and Grand Turk have their advocates. The journal's navigational data allows multiple interpretations, and no definitive archaeological evidence settles the question. Most historians consider Watling Island or Samana Key the most probable locations. The indigenous people Columbus encountered were Taínos, part of the Arawakan cultural and linguistic group that had migrated through the Caribbean from South America. They lived in organized villages, practiced agriculture, cultivated cassava and other crops, fashioned sophisticated pottery, and maintained extensive inter-island trading networks. They wore little or no clothing, which the Europeans noted with interest, and decorated themselves with paint and jewelry. They possessed small amounts of gold, which immediately caught the explorers' attention. Columbus examined these people with intense interest, observing their physical appearance, their behavior, and their possessions. His journal entries reveal his thinking clearly. These people seemed gentle and generous. They lacked weapons capable of resisting Europeans. They could be converted to Christianity, and they could be made to serve Spanish interests. He noted explicitly that they would make good servants and could easily be subjugated. These observations, recorded at the very first encounter, reveal assumptions and intentions that would shape all subsequent interactions. The fleet spent the next 3 months exploring the Caribbean. Columbus sailed southwestward through the Bahamas, searching for the gold he was certain must exist in larger quantities somewhere nearby. He reached Cuba on October 28, believing it might be mainland China or perhaps Japan. The island's size impressed him, and he sent expeditions inland seeking the great cities Marco Polo had described. They found only small Taino villages. Columbus required his officers to sign statements affirming that Cuba was mainland Asia, an early indication of his tendency to insist his interpretations were correct regardless of evidence. In December, the fleet reached Hispaniola, a large island where the Taínos possessed greater quantities of gold. The local cacique, or chief, Guacanagari, received the Spanish peacefully and traded gold objects for European trinkets. On Christmas Eve, the Santa Maria ran aground on the northern coast of Hispaniola and could not be refloated. Columbus salvaged everything possible from the wrecked flagship and decided to leave a garrison at the site. Using timber from the Santa Maria, his men constructed a small fortification called La Navidad. 39 volunteers agreed to remain, with instructions to trade for gold and explore the island's interior, while Columbus returned to Spain for additional ships and supplies. Martin Alonso Pinzon, who had separated from Columbus for several weeks to explore independently, rejoined the expedition in early January 1493. Relations between Columbus and Pinzon had deteriorated significantly, with Columbus suspecting Pinzon of seeking independent glory and profit. The remaining 2 ships, Niña and Pinta, departed Hispaniola on January 16, 1493, carrying some Taino people taken captive to be presented in Spain. *** Sources used. ** Admiral of the Ocean Sea. A Life of Christopher Columbus, Samuel Eliot Morison, pp. 183-304 * Columbus, The Four Voyages, Laurence Bergreen, pp. 65-145. Columbus, Felipe Fernández-Armesto, pp. 74-95. * 1492. Felipe Fernández-Armesto, pp. 87-107. Part 5, Return to Spain. The return voyage tested Columbus more severely than the outbound journey. He attempted to sail directly eastward, but this route took him far north of the reliable trade winds. The ships encountered powerful winter storms in the Atlantic. In mid-February, a violent tempest separated the Niña and Pinta. Columbus believed his ship would sink and prepared written accounts of his discoveries, sealed in barrels and thrown overboard, hoping some record might survive even if he did not. The Niña survived and made landfall in the Azores, Portuguese territory, in late February. After tense interactions with Portuguese authorities suspicious of Spanish activities in regions Portugal considered within its sphere of influence, Columbus continued to Lisbon, arriving on March 4. King John II received him and examined his reports with great interest and likely considerable regret, having rejected this very expedition years earlier. Columbus departed quickly for Spain, concerned about Portuguese intentions. The Niña reached Palos on March 15, 1493. The Pinta arrived the same day, having survived the storms independently. Martin Alonso Pinzon, seriously ill, died within weeks. Columbus sent news of his discoveries immediately to Ferdinand and Isabella, who were at Barcelona. His letter, describing the islands, the indigenous people, and the prospects for wealth and conversion, created an immediate sensation. Columbus was summoned to the royal court and received with extraordinary honor. He presented the Taino captives he had brought, along with samples of gold, exotic birds, plants, and artifacts. Ferdinand and Isabella granted him the titles promised in the Capitulations of Santa Fe, Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy and Governor of the discovered lands. The Catholic monarchs authorized a much larger second expedition to establish a permanent Spanish presence in the new territories. The news spread rapidly throughout Europe. Columbus's letter was printed and reprinted in multiple editions and translations. The discovery generated intense diplomatic activity, particularly between Spain and Portugal. Both kingdoms claimed rights to newly discovered territories, and conflict seemed possible. Pope Alexander VI, a Spanish pope born Rodrigo Borgia, issued a series of papal bulls in 1493 dividing the non-Christian world between Spain and Portugal along a north-south line in the Atlantic. Portugal objected to the initial demarcation, and direct negotiations between the two kingdoms produced the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, moving the dividing line farther west, approximately 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands. This adjustment would eventually give Portugal claim to Brazil. These diplomatic arrangements assumed that Columbus had indeed reached Asian territories or islands adjacent to Asia. Neither the Spanish nor the Portuguese yet understood that an entirely separate landmass, previously unknown to European geography, lay across the Atlantic. That realization would emerge only gradually over the next decade. Sources used. Admiral of the Ocean Sea. A Life of Christopher Columbus, Samuel Eliot Morison, pp. 305-366, Columbus. The Four Voyages, Laurence Bergreen, pp. 146-178, Columbus, Felipe Fernández-Armesto, pp. 96-108, Part 6. The later voyages. Columbus's second voyage departed Spain in September 1493 with 17 ships and approximately 1,200 men, including colonists, soldiers, clergy, and officials. This was not an exploratory expedition, but a colonizing mission, intended to establish permanent Spanish settlement and begin extracting wealth from the discovered territories. The fleet carried livestock, seeds, tools, and supplies for establishing farms and towns. The second voyage reached the Caribbean in November 1493, making landfall in the Lesser Antilles. Columbus explored these smaller islands before proceeding to Hispaniola, arriving at La Navidad in late November. The fort had been destroyed, and all 39 men left there were dead. Columbus learned from indigenous reports that the garrison had alienated their Taino hosts through demands for women and gold, had divided into factions, and had been killed in retaliation. This disaster foreshadowed the patterns that would characterize Spanish-indigenous relations. Columbus established a new settlement, La Isabella, on Hispaniola's northern coast. He left his brother Diego in charge and spent several months exploring Cuba and Jamaica, still seeking evidence of mainland Asia and the wealthy cities he expected to find. He found neither, returning to La Isabella to discover the colony in crisis. Disease, hunger, and conflict with indigenous peoples had devastated the settlement. Many colonists were ill, supplies were inadequate, and expectations of easy wealth had been bitterly disappointed. Columbus attempted to make the colony profitable by instituting a tribute system, requiring Taino adults to deliver fixed quantities of gold at regular intervals. Those who failed to meet the quota faced punishment, including mutilation. This system proved catastrophic for the indigenous population. The island did not contain sufficient gold to meet Spanish demands. The Taino, disrupted from their agricultural cycles and subjected to violence, began to die in large numbers from disease, starvation, and harsh treatment. Some resisted. Spanish forces crushed these rebellions with military superiority. Columbus also sent shipments of enslaved indigenous people to Spain, hoping to generate revenue, though Isabella questioned this practice and eventually forbade enslaving indigenous people who had not rebelled against Spanish authority. Discontent among the Spanish colonists grew as well. Many had expected quick wealth but found only hardship. Complaints about Columbus's governance reached Spain. In 1496, Columbus returned to Spain to defend his administration and secure additional support. He had been absent from Hispaniola for most of his governorship, leaving his brothers Diego and Bartholomew in charge, and neither proved more effective than Columbus himself at managing the colony's problems. Columbus's third voyage, departing in May 1498 with 6 ships, took a more southerly route across the Atlantic. In late July, he sighted the island of Trinidad and then the northern coast of South America near the Orinoco River Delta. He observed the tremendous volume of freshwater flowing from the river and theorized that only a continent could produce such a flow, though he struggled to reconcile this observation with his belief that he was near Asia. He explored portions of the Venezuelan coast before proceeding to Hispaniola. Arriving at Santo Domingo, the colony's new capital established by his brother Bartholomew, Columbus found conditions worse than before. Spanish factions were in open conflict. Francisco Roldan, a royal official, had led a rebellion against Bartholomew Columbus's authority. The indigenous population continued to decline catastrophically. The colony had produced little wealth, and many colonists demanded to return to Spain. Columbus attempted various compromises, including granting land and indigenous laborers to Spanish settlers through an informal precursor to the encomienda system. Reports of chaos reached Ferdinand and Isabella, who dispatched Francisco de Bobadilla as royal commissioner to investigate and assume authority if necessary. Bobadilla arrived in August 1500, gathered testimony about Columbus's governance, much of it damning, and arrested Columbus and his brothers. They were returned to Spain in chains, a humiliating reversal for the Admiral of the Ocean Sea. The monarchs received Columbus and ordered his release, but they did not restore his governmental authority. Nicolás de Ovando was appointed as Hispaniola's new governor. Despite this disgrace, Columbus remained determined to vindicate his theories through further exploration. He convinced Ferdinand and Isabella to authorize a 4th voyage with a specific mission: to find a westward passage around or through the lands he had discovered, reaching the Indian Ocean and proving the westward route to Asia. 4 ships departed Spain in May 1502 with Columbus, now aged 51, his brother Bartholomew, and his younger son Ferdinand, who later wrote a biography of his father. The 4th voyage explored the Central American coast from Honduras to Panama, seeking the elusive passage. Columbus and his men endured tremendous hardships: hurricanes, hostile encounters with indigenous peoples, shipworm damage that rendered their vessels barely seaworthy, and tropical diseases. They explored rivers and inlets hoping each might prove the sought passage to the Indian Ocean. They found none, though they gathered information about a great ocean, the Pacific, that lay beyond the mountains. By 1503, Columbus's ships were deteriorating rapidly. He attempted to return to Hispaniola, but was forced to beach his last 2 vessels on Jamaica. The expedition remained stranded there for a year. Columbus sent messengers in native canoes to Hispaniola requesting rescue, but Governor Ovando was in no hurry to assist the man he had replaced. Some of Columbus's crew mutinied. Columbus survived partly through theatrical use of his knowledge of an upcoming lunar eclipse, warning indigenous leaders that his god would darken the moon if they ceased providing food. The eclipse occurred as predicted, reportedly impressing the Taínos sufficiently to resume trade. Rescue finally arrived in June 1504, and Columbus returned to Spain in November, exhausted and seriously ill. This final voyage had produced geographic knowledge but no passage to Asia and no significant wealth. Columbus would never return to the territories he had discovered. Sources used. Admiral of the Ocean Sea. A Life of Christopher Columbus, Samuel Eliot Morison, pp. 367-664 Columbus. The Four Voyages Laurence Bergreen, pp. 179-428 Columbus, Felipe Fernández-Armesto, pp. 109-159, Part 7, Columbus and Indigenous Peoples. The relationship between Columbus and the indigenous peoples he encountered has become one of the most contentious aspects of his historical legacy. Modern scholarly examination of this relationship requires careful attention to primary sources, chronology, and context, while avoiding both hagiography and anachronistic condemnation. The initial encounters between Columbus and the Taínos were not immediately violent. Columbus's journal entries from October 1492 describe exchanges of gifts, expressions of mutual curiosity, and generally peaceful interactions. The Taínos approached the Europeans with what appears to have been openness, offering food, water, and small trade goods. Columbus noted their generosity and their apparent lack of defensive weapons. He observed their physical appearance and customs with an explorer's interest in cataloging the novel and unfamiliar. Yet these same journal entries reveal Columbus's immediate assessment of the Taínos as potential subjects and laborers. On October 12, after just hours of contact, he wrote that the indigenous people ought to make good and skilled servants, for they repeat very quickly whatever we say to them. He noted that, with 50 men we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want. These observations reflected European assumptions about their own superiority and their right to dominate non-Christian peoples, assumptions Columbus fully shared. Columbus's primary objective throughout his voyages remained finding wealth, particularly gold, to justify the Spanish investment and fulfill his promises to Ferdinand and Isabella. The Taínos possessed small quantities of gold ornaments, which they traded willingly. Columbus believed substantial gold sources must exist nearby and pressured indigenous leaders for information about gold deposits. This pressure intensified with each voyage as Columbus's need to demonstrate profitable results became more desperate. The establishment of permanent Spanish settlement fundamentally altered the relationship. The colonists demanded food from Taíno communities, disrupting indigenous agricultural systems. They seized Taíno women, provoking conflict. Columbus instituted the tribute system during his second voyage, requiring indigenous adults in mining regions to deliver gold quotas every 3 months. Those who failed received punishment, reportedly including having their hands cut off, though documentation of specific atrocities varies in reliability. This system proved impossible for the Taínos to fulfill and catastrophic in its effects. The demographic collapse of Hispaniola's indigenous population stands among history's most severe cases of population decline. Estimates of the per-contact Taíno population vary widely, from tens of thousands to several 100,000, but all sources agree the decline was precipitous. By 1508, perhaps 60,000 Taínos remained. By 1548, the indigenous population had essentially disappeared as a distinct community. The causes of this collapse were multiple: European diseases to which indigenous people had no immunity, forced labor, disruption of food production, violence, and social disintegration. Spanish colonization created conditions in which indigenous societies could not sustain themselves. Determining Columbus's personal responsibility requires distinguishing among several categories of action. Columbus personally authorized and enforced the gold tribute system. He sanctioned slavery of Tainos captured in conflict and sent at least 4 shiploads of enslaved people to Spain between 1494 and 1496. He employed military force against indigenous resistance. These actions directly caused suffering and death, and Columbus bears clear responsibility for them. Other aspects of the demographic catastrophe derived from broader colonial systems rather than Columbus's specific decisions. The spread of European diseases occurred independently of policy, though Spanish disruption of indigenous communities accelerated disease transmission. The encomienda system, which granted Spanish settlers control over indigenous labor, was formalized after Columbus lost governmental authority, though he had introduced informal versions. The long-term development of plantation agriculture and imported African slavery occurred after Columbus's death. Contemporary Spanish observers varied in their assessments of Columbus's treatment of indigenous people. Bartolomé de las Casas, who arrived in Hispaniola in 1502 and later became the most prominent critic of Spanish colonial abuses, placed significant blame on Columbus for initiating systems of exploitation. Las Casas's History of the Indies provides devastating accounts of Spanish cruelty, though he wrote decades after the events and sometimes generalized from specific incidents. Other contemporaries, including some colonists and officials, criticized Columbus's governance primarily for its inefficiency and failure to produce wealth, not for humanitarian concerns. Columbus's own writings reveal a complex mentality. He genuinely believed in converting indigenous peoples to Christianity, which he considered a spiritual benefit justifying temporal subjugation. He saw himself as fulfilling divine purpose. He expressed occasional concern about Spanish abuses when they threatened colonial stability, but not consistent moral objection to the systems he established. He distinguished between friendly, indigenous people who submitted to Spanish authority and hostile groups who resisted, considering the latter enslavable. These distinctions were conventional for his time, but provided justification for violence. Modern historians have debated how to evaluate Columbus within his historical context. Some argue that judging 16th-century actions by 21st-century standards is anachronistic, and that Columbus should be understood as a man of his time, sharing his era's assumptions about European superiority, the rights of Christian monarchs, and the acceptability of forced labor. Others contend that even by contemporary standards, Columbus's actions generated criticism, and that the catastrophic consequences for indigenous peoples must be central to any historical assessment. The scholarly consensus acknowledges Columbus's historical importance while recognizing the devastating impact of the colonial systems he initiated. He was neither the singular villain responsible for all subsequent colonial abuses, nor an innocent explorer whose discoveries were later misused by others. He was an ambitious navigator whose successful voyages opened sustained contact between previously separate worlds, and he was also a colonial administrator who established systems of forced labor and tribute that proved lethal for indigenous populations. Both dimensions of his legacy are historically real and significant. *** sources used. ** Admiral of the Ocean Sea. A Life of Christopher Columbus, Samuel Eliot Morison, pp. 493-543 Columbus. The Four Voyages Laurence Bergreen, pp. 113-145, 208-267. The Conquest of Paradise Kirkpatrick Sale, pp. 155-201, * 1491, Charles C. Mann, pp. 39-88. Asterisk 1493, Charles C. Mann, pp. 17-52. Asterisk Cambridge History of the Native Peoples of the Americas, Vol. III, pp. 140-3197, Part 8, Columbus's final years. Columbus spent his final years in Spain, increasingly ill and consumed by grievances over what he considered insufficient recognition and rewards for his discoveries. He suffered from arthritis, probably reactive arthritis caused by infections contracted during his voyages, and possibly from other chronic conditions. His mobility decreased, and periods of debilitating pain became frequent. His primary concern during these years was securing the titles, revenues, and privileges promised in the Capitulations of Santa Fe. The crown had stripped him of governmental authority in the discovered territories, but Columbus believed the hereditary titles of Admiral, Viceroy, and Governor remained valid, along with the promised 10% of all wealth generated by the lands he had discovered. He pursued these claims persistently through legal arguments and appeals to the monarch's sense of justice. Ferdinand and Isabella treated Columbus with outward respect. They granted him audiences and provided financial support, but they did not restore his governmental powers and disputed the extent of revenues owed to him. The monarchs recognized that Columbus's geographical theories had been fundamentally wrong. These were not Asian territories, and that his administrative record had been disastrous. They valued his achievements as an explorer while concluding he was unsuited for governance. Columbus compiled a document called the Book of Privileges, gathering copies of all royal grants and agreements to document his legal claims. He prepared extensive journals and letters describing his discoveries, emphasizing their significance and his role. These documents reveal a man acutely concerned with his historical reputation and his family's future status. His sons Diego and Ferdinand would inherit not just property, but the burden of defending their father's legacy and pursuing his financial claims. Queen Isabella died in November 1504, shortly after Columbus's return from his fourth voyage. Columbus lost an important advocate. King Ferdinand showed less personal sympathy for Columbus's claims and focused on consolidating Spanish control over the growing American empire. Columbus's health continued to decline through 1505 and 1506. Columbus died on May 20, 1506, in Valladolid, Spain. He was 54 or 55 years old. His sons and a few close associates attended him. Contemporary records of his death are sparse and indicate little public notice. The great navigator died in relative obscurity, with his discoveries' true significance not yet fully understood, and his own assessment of those discoveries, that he had found a route to Asia, proven incorrect. His burial location became extraordinarily complicated. He was initially buried in Valladolid, then moved to Seville. His remains were reportedly transferred to Santo Domingo in Hispaniola in 1537 to honor his connection to the New World. In 1795, when Spain ceded Hispaniola to France, remains believed to be Columbus's were moved to Havana, Cuba. In 1898, when Spain lost Cuba, the remains were returned to Seville Cathedral, where a monument to Columbus exists today. However, in 1877, a lead box with an inscription identifying the remains as Columbus's was discovered in Santo Domingo, generating a dispute over which remains are genuine. DNA testing has produced inconclusive results, and the question remains unresolved. This confused burial history serves as an ironic coda to Columbus's complex legacy. Sources used. Admiral of the Ocean Sea. A Life of Christopher Columbus. Samuel Eliot Morison, pp. 665-684, Columbus. The Four Voyages, Laurence Bergreen, pp. 429-448, Columbus Felipe Fernández-Armesto, pp. 161-71, Part 9, Columbus's historical legacy. The voyages of Christopher Columbus initiated what historians call the Columbian Exchange, a term coined by Alfred Crosby to describe the widespread transfer of plants, animals, culture, human populations, technology, and diseases between the Americas and the Old World. This exchange fundamentally transformed both hemispheres and reshaped global history. The biological dimensions of the Columbian exchange were profound. European ships carried wheat, rice, sugar cane, coffee, horses, cattle, pigs, and sheep to the Americas. From the Americas, maize, potatoes, tomatoes, peppers, cacao, tobacco, and numerous other crops spread to Europe, Africa, and Asia. The introduction of American crops, particularly potatoes and maize, eventually enabled significant population growth in Eurasia. The potato became a staple crop in northern Europe, supporting increased populations in regions where wheat grew poorly. Maize spread rapidly through southern Europe and into Africa and China, becoming a crucial food source. The transfer of European livestock transformed American landscapes. Horses, unknown in the Americas since the Pleistocene extinctions, returned and spread rapidly, fundamentally changing indigenous cultures, particularly on the Great Plains and in southern South America. Cattle and pigs, reproducing in American environments with few natural predators, became feral in many regions and altered ecosystems. The introduction of sugarcane to the Caribbean and Brazil created the foundation for plantation economies that would shape these regions for centuries. The exchange of diseases proved catastrophic for indigenous American populations. Native Americans had no immunity to smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, and other Eurasian diseases. These pathogens spread through indigenous populations with devastating effect, typically killing 50 to 90% of affected communities. The demographic collapse was continental in scale. Populations that may have numbered 50 to 100 million in 1490, one had declined to perhaps 5 to 10 million by the early 17th century. This die-off was the greatest demographic catastrophe in recorded history, and it fundamentally shaped colonial history, as European colonization occurred into demographic voids created by disease. The Columbian exchange included the forced transfer of enslaved Africans to the Americas, eventually totaling approximately 12 million people transported across the Atlantic. This horrific trade developed because European colonizers required labor for plantation agriculture after indigenous populations declined, and because African populations had greater resistance to certain European and tropical diseases than indigenous Americans. The African diaspora created by the slave trade transformed American societies culturally, demographically, and economically. Columbus's voyages initiated European colonization of the Americas, though the full scope and nature of that colonization developed over subsequent centuries and involved many nations, thousands of individual actors, and complex historical processes. Columbus himself governed only briefly and ineffectively. The Spanish colonial system that emerged included elements Columbus introduced, particularly forced labor and tribute, but extended far beyond his direct influence. Other colonial powers, Portugal, France, England, the Netherlands, developed their own systems, some more destructive than others, but all premised on European dominance and control of indigenous lands. The economic consequences of European colonization were immense. Silver from American mines, particularly Potosi in present-day Bolivia, flooded into European economies, funding Spanish imperial ambitions and contributing to price inflation. American gold also enriched European monarchs and merchants. Colonial products, sugar, tobacco, coffee, cotton, indigo, drove Atlantic trade networks and contributed to European economic development. The wealth extracted from the Americas helped finance Europe's rise to global dominance over subsequent centuries. Columbus's reputation has fluctuated dramatically over the 5 centuries since his death. For much of this period, particularly from the 18th through mid-20th centuries, he was celebrated as a heroic explorer, visionary navigator, and harbinger of progress. The United States adopted Columbus as a founding figure, with numerous cities, institutions, and monuments named in his honor. Columbus Day became a federal holiday in 1937. Italian-American communities especially embraced Columbus as an ethnic hero, evidence that Italians had contributed to American history from its beginning. This celebratory narrative began to face serious challenge in the later 20th century as historians examined colonial history more critically, and as indigenous peoples' perspectives gained greater attention. Scholarship on the demographic catastrophe, the violence of conquest, and the destruction of indigenous cultures reframed Columbus's voyages as initiating tragedy rather than simply progress. The quincentennial of 1492, marked in 1992, became an occasion for protest and historical reassessment rather than uncomplicated celebration. Contemporary historical scholarship presents Columbus as a complex and contradictory figure. He was an exceptionally skilled navigator, whose determination and seamanship achieved a voyage most contemporaries considered impossible or irrational. His crossing of the Atlantic with the limited technology of the 15th century represents a genuine achievement of exploration. He was also profoundly wrong in his geographical theories, never acknowledging that he had encountered continents unknown to European learning rather than reaching Asia. He was a capable sailor, but a poor governor whose administration proved disastrous for colonists and catastrophic for indigenous peoples. The current scholarly consensus acknowledges that Columbus cannot be understood outside the historical context of 15th-century Europe, with its assumptions about Christian superiority, its economic motivations, and its limited geographical knowledge. Yet context does not eliminate moral evaluation. Columbus's establishment of forced labor systems, his enslavement of indigenous people, and his willingness to employ violence in pursuit of wealth can be judged as wrong even while acknowledging they reflected broader European attitudes. The catastrophic consequences of colonization for indigenous Americans must be central to any honest historical assessment, even while recognizing that disease transmission was not deliberate and that colonial systems developed over time through many actors' decisions. The question of how to commemorate Columbus remains contested. Many cities have replaced Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day, recognizing that Columbus's arrival initiated catastrophe for the hemisphere's original inhabitants. Some Columbus monuments have been removed or relocated. Others argue that Columbus remains historically significant and that removing recognition erases important history. These debates reflect broader discussions about how societies should reckon with morally complex pasts and whose perspectives should be centered in historical commemoration. Columbus's legacy is inseparable from the enormous historical transformations his voyages initiated. The connection of previously separate hemispheres created the modern world's global character. For better and often for worse, the biological exchanges, the economic integration, the cultural encounters, and the demographic catastrophes that followed 1492 shaped the world we inhabit. Understanding this legacy requires neither condemning everything about Columbus nor celebrating him uncritically, but rather examining with clear eyes both what he achieved and what his achievements cost. *** Sources used. * 1493. Charles C. Mann, entire volume, particularly pp. 152, 124-8, 312-396. The Columbian Exchange, Alfred W. Crosby, pp. 35, 164, 188-217. Admiral of the Ocean Sea. A Life of Christopher Columbus, Samuel Eliot Morison, pp. 685-694. Columbus, Felipe Fernández-Armesto, pp. 172-192, The Discovery of Mankind, David Abulafia, pp. 13-77, Cambridge History of Latin America, Vol. I, pp. 165-214, Cambridge History of the Native Peoples of the Americas, Vol. III, pp. 143-50.